Are you looking for more ways to use up those strips of fabric? Join me today and let's talk about strips of fabric that we have. Hi, I'm Roberta from Quilt Crafters Corner, and today I want to talk a little bit more about those strips of fabric that we have left over from projects. Now, I have a lot of them. I'm sure everyone does. So if this is something you like, if you could please like the video, I would appreciate it. Also, leave me a comment. Have you made strip blocks before? I'd love to know. So let's talk a little bit about strip blocks. Now, these are made with strips of fabric that we have left over from a lot of different projects. And I happen to have cuts that are not very consistent. They're kind of different widths, so it makes it a little bit harder to do things with. So in looking for a way to use these, or a better use for these, I went back to one of the old strip piecing on paper. Now, there's several good points about paper, there's several bad points about paper. There's also what I call foundation piecing, where you're actually sewing it onto another piece of fabric. So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, and I want to show you how to do it and kind of give you some ideas, ways for you to use up those strips that you have. Now, remember, when you're sewing these pieces of fabric, some of them may not have straight edges, so I always make sure that I've got a nice straight edge to work with, so that when I sew these down, they're kind of laying nice and flat, and they also will they won't fray. So just little things like that. Also, a nice straight seam really makes a big difference. So these are just a few of the fundamental things that we need to remember when we're sewing strips of fabric together. So let's go over to the cutting table and I will show you what I'm talking about. And in the meantime, if you could like the video, and please subscribe if you haven't, and let's go to the cutting table and I'll show you how this works. Okay, so here are a couple of the blocks that I've made, and like I said, I have these really lovely novelty type prints and I have a whole lot of this brown with the polka dots, which I just really love. I think it's really quite pretty. So I'm thinking, what can I do with all of these strips of fabric to make into? So what I've done is I've sewn them on some old scrap paper that somebody gave me, and so here's the paper on the back. And here is how I have it laid out right now. So let's start with the paper first. Now, because the paper is 8.5, the biggest square I'm going to get out of this is 8.5 by 8.5. So what I do is I start with my full sheet of paper. And there's several ways you can cut it. You know, I actually use my rotary cut. I can use my rotary cutter. Just go here to 8.5, put my ruler down, and you know, you could cut a stack of 2 or 3 or 4. I have an old blade in when I do the paper, just so that I'm not ruining a new blade. But it's an easy way to do it. The other thing that I have is a paper cutter, and it, you know, same thing, it will work too. So now that I have my square, the first thing I do is I draw a center line from on the diagonal from point to point, and I just kind of move it over the line just a little bit, so that when I put the line on, it's actually at the center. Okay, so I have my center line, and what that does is it gives me a place to line my fabrics up. Now, since I chose to center this center strip on the line, what I can do is I could put a line a 1/2 inch on each side, or what is this? This is 1.5 inches, so 3/4 of an inch on each side. And then that way I know if I'm not, so that I'm not going over. I know that this is going to be lined up. So there's my center lines. So now I can line my strip up, and look at that. It fits very nicely there. So that way you know that your center strip's going to be centered. Now, you do not have to center these. You could actually line these up 1/4 inch past that line and sew them that way and start doing that. So there's, several different ways that you can use these strips up. So normally what I do is I'll put one strip of fabric down, and now I'll pin this. And when you pin this, you're going to need to make sure you go through that paper so that it doesn't move. And this just makes it a little bit easier to sew these first strips down. So I really do like to pin it down just so it doesn't go anywhere, and I know it's gonna stay put. So I will take this to the machine and sew this down. Okay, so there's my first strip down. So now I'm going to add my second one, and I will just be putting it on the other side now. And just like that. And once again, pin these down just so that they don't go anywhere. Now, when you go to sew these down, shorten your stitch length on your machine. You want to get it smaller than you normally do. It just makes taking the paper off easier. So I'll sew this one now. Okay, so there's my my first 3 strips. Now, I stop sewing once I get right off the paper. I'll take maybe 1 or 2 stitches past the paper. That way these pieces are not quite, they're more usable then. I don't have to sit there and take stitches out. So now I will just keep adding strips to this and continue on until I cover these outside points. And you want to make sure you cover them all the way. You could get really close. It doesn't have to be exactly over, but you need to have that 1/4 inch in order to put these together. So make sure that you get really close to those outside points. So let me show you one that is finished. Okay, so this one is finished and all the strips are sewn on. So now from the back side, what I'm going to do is take my ruler and just trim this up. And I have a nice little pile of scraps over there. Okay, so that's all trimmed up, and there is my block. And it fits very nicely. Now, if you want all of your centers to come to a point where they all meet very nicely, make sure that your strips are even. All of your center one can be a different width, but make sure these are matching and everything on the way out is matching, and then your centers will match better this way. So that's one way of doing it. Now this little extra strip here, this is a very good way of using up some of these scraps that you've created over here. And just start sewing them down to on the paper, and then you could actually even use this as one of the strips here in this strip piece. So now that we've looked at these, let's look at the foundation piecing, where you actually use what I call a foundation piece. And this is an old sheet. This is just an old sheet that works really well for sewing the strips down. It's thin, it's light, it can be easily used. You don't have to use an old sheet. You can use old fabric that you don't like or you don't know what to do with, or maybe even fabric that's too thin and you don't think you can do anything with, because you want to put nicer quality on top of your quilt so that it lasts longer. So if you have something that's maybe not quite up to your standards, you could use it this way. Just make sure that whatever you're going to lay on top will hide if there's a pattern or a design or it's too dark. Just make sure you can, it's not going to bleed through, or you're going to see it through your layer that you're going to put down. So this is an excellent way to use up old material, or if you don't have that, you could go get muslin at the fabric store and use that. That works also. So let's take a look at, now here's the one that I did, and this is on foundation. It's just sewn down. And this one I did a little differently. I centered 2 strips on the point, so that way it gives it a little bit different look. You can do that. So then once I get this all done, then I just trim this up. And once again, okay, and there's my square. So now it's all ready to be sewn into a quilt top. This could easily be done just the way it is. There's nothing necessary to do to it. Because you have this piece of fabric on the back, these are not going to stretch, unlike these, because these are paper and you got to take all this paper out. These are gonna stretch much more. These not so much. They're gonna give you a nice seam there that you can add these all together with. Really easy to do. Now let's talk about the paper. The paper, the pros are it's quick, it's easy, it's fast. You can just sew them right on. The downside is you have to take all of this paper off. So the 2 tricks that I know of is fold on your seam line, shorten your stitch, make a shorter stitch. That way it's almost like you're perforating the paper for it to be torn off. And then once you go to tear this off, it just kind of comes off easily, and then just pull your stitches out of there. And then you're going to do the same thing. Fold on that perforated line and just tear that out, and it'll just start coming out. Now the problem with paper piecing, or doing it on paper, is you have to be careful that you don't pull your stitches out when you're removing this paper. So the thinner the paper, the better. It just makes it easier to come out, and it also holds better. Now, you can sew these together and put your top and then tear the paper out. It's really entirely up to you which way you want to do it. If you want to tear the paper out first, then I highly recommend that you go through and you do an 1/8 of an inch seam. Just sew all the way around the block with an 1/8 of an inch, and then that way it keeps this from stretching, because this is all on the bias. All of these cuts are on the bias, so they are going to stretch and they're going to move on you. So just do yourself a favor and just an 1/8 of an inch, and if you're going to take that paper out before you sew them together. So these are easy to take out. As I said, you just kind of just pull a little bit on that, and that paper will just pop right out of there. And then just fold it over. Just do a press, a finger press. Run your nail on it, and then just start tearing. And it's They will. You'll get the hang of it. It will tear out fairly easy. Now this is pretty thick paper. That's why it's not wanting to tear real easy for me. But it's what I have and it's what I use for scraps, so it doesn't really need to be a, and use magazines. Magazines work good. Telephone pages, but there's no telephone books anymore. Don't use newspaper because that black newsprint will bleed through on your fabric if you iron it too much. So the newsprint does not work. So anyways, there's those strips and there's this strips. Now let's talk about a couple of other ideas you can do with these. I like the foundation piece because you can cut these bigger. If I wanted to cut these 12.5 to have a 12-inch finished square, I could do it easier with the fabric than I can with the paper. You'll have to find bigger paper to do that. But that's why I like the fabric on the back, because it just makes it easier to cut those bigger squares. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the ideas. Some of the ideas for this. I could easily make half of this neutral and half of this color, and then I've got two half square triangles looking next to each other. This would make a very lovely star pattern, because that's all star patterns are, made out of half square triangles. You're just doing it on a little bigger scale. There's many ideas you could do. You could contrast dark and light and get this striped effect. And then as you put these together, if you've matched them up, you could reverse your strips. So like you've got your neutral over here and your darker over here, and it kind of gives you this look going through your quilt top. There's many ideas that you can do with this type of pattern. So as you can see, there's many different things you can still do with those strips of fabric that you have. It's easy to take them out, play with them, just make sure that you square them up, that they're nice and straight, so that when you sew them, you get that nice straight seam. It's really important, especially with making the strip box. The other thing that you need to remember to do is have an idea in mind of what you want to do, which way you want your colors to go, or the varying ways that you can put your strips together. This will give your quilt top much more expression. It will give it that look of almost like it was planned, but maybe a little bit of a surprise. So these are things that you need to think about when you're putting these strips together. Is your contrast. Make sure that you don't put two together that don't quite look right. Look at them. Make sure that you like what you see before you sew them down. These are just some of the things that I find are really interesting. You think two colors that won't go together, and yet they do. So play with this, experiment with this. I want to give you different ideas to vary how things work together and the look that you're going after in your quilt top. If we do the same thing over and over again, it gets kind of boring. So I want to give you something new and something exciting to go play with. And try this out. This makes a really pretty quilt top. So for those of you that have made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and I appreciate it. And if you haven't liked or subscribed to the channel, please do. It helps me out. And until next time, keep quilting.